Hey, Paul.
Hey, Fab.
How's it going?
Good, you?
Good. Good. All right. I thought you were going to say more than that. You usually say more than that.
Oh, I can say more. How are you feeling now that you have COVID?
I'm pretty fortunate. It's not so bad. I gotta
Yeah,
admit.
you're on the uphill. So
What's that say?
I said you're on the uphill. So we forgive you for wearing a hoodie.
No, I always wear a hoodie. It's my thing now.
Oh, do you?
um,
Right.
yeah, I mean, obviously not in the summer, but it's freezing today. What did I want to say? I do lose my track of blah blah blah.
Yeah. You want me to start it off?
Yeah, maybe that's a good idea.
Okay. So Fab's not drunk. He has COVID and he's on medication. So if he's a little wonky, we know why. But it's a really interesting subject today. It's how to manage sales reps during tough times. And
Yeah, and actually, I'll chime in there, and I think the kind of the idea for that show um, came from not directly from clients that I'm working with, but it's obviously a tough time in certain industries, right? A lot of startups, especially in particular, are letting go a lot of people, but salespeople as well. A lot of people like grew too fast, and now that there's some uncertain times because of inflation and where the economy might be heading and stuff like that. A lot of people are being let go, but then reps that are staying, obviously have to keep things going. So I just notice that it's relatively a tough environment for a lot of people out there, and so we've had conversations in the past about tough times when COVID first hit and stuff like that. So I'm sure some of the themes will come up and we have a few new listeners since. So I thought it'd be interesting to talk about that again.
I think it is important to talk about it, and not to be too Machiavellian, but the first thing I think you need to do when you go through tough times is establish what your goals are for the next 6 to 12 months. And then look at your team, look at your resources, and decide what it is you expect from them and what size team you need, right? To be realistic. So, if you've got a team of 20 salespeople and you think the next year is going to be really tough and you've been hit really hard, let's say you're in an industry like a SaaS industry that's just been disseminated, well, you've got to be realistic, right?
Yeah.
But you have to think about what's going to happen after the tough time. The tough time won't go forever. So, but that's the first part. And when I say you need to do an analysis there, you've got to be I think you have to do a real calculation, dollars and cents, expectations, actions, who you're trying to go after, like create a real action plan and then see how your team is built and what to do at that level. So before you manage anything, before you make any decision, you've got to do a calculated estimate of how it is you're going to deal with this. If you're the kind of company that really, and I applaud these people. If you're the kind of company that says, okay, we're going to support these people, it's a tough time, we're going to all tighten our belts and we're going to restructure the way we do things without letting people go, that's great. And then maybe you change expectations. You might have to change your remuneration package, but you've got to be very, I believe, transparent and clear in what the expectations are and what you need to do before you even manage the team. So I'm talking at a higher level, at a strategic level. And a lot of people don't do that well.
Well, it's hard, right? Like it's not an easy task to do, right? It's not. One is to accept that because there's always a concern, like, are we really heading, like, is it just a tough few weeks, months, but we'll be okay by November, and then you don't want to like switch around things too much. So it's not, and usually it's always like after the fact, right? Like hindsight's always 2020. Like, oh, we should have, because the writing was on the wall. But when you're in that moment, you're kind of holding on to that hope that it's fleeting. I mean, even if I remember, if we go back to the first COVID, like I was like, it's just going to be a few weeks, right? Like it's not going to be a big deal. You kind of hold on to that hope that things will be okay.
Yeah, they were okay for 2 years, right? If anything, it gave in certain markets, it gave a boost to the economy, right?
Yeah,
So,
of course, that's true.
until the shortage operationally hit a lot of manufacturing sectors. But so all that to say that look at your industry, look at realistically what it means post COVID in this recession time. What are your true expectations, and then look at your team and see what you expect from your team and what you want to give to your team, because it's not just what can they give me, but what do I want to give them. How loyal can I be, or do I want to be in these times?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a question you have to ask yourself. But you got to be pragmatic in the way you're going to deal with this. It can't just be, well, I'll see, and you've got to look at the data, calculate the data, see how the data affects your reality, and then move forward. But
Yeah.
so strategically speaking, so let's say you've done all that and you've decided, okay, I'm keeping the team. But then you also have to manage the team through these difficult times. And we've talked about this in the past, but if you know the actions your team needs to do, and what they're you're showing them the proper methodology, and have a good idea of what the external forces are, how they're going to affect this, then you might have an idea of the results. And you've
Mm-hmm.
got to be realistic in those results. But you've got to really focus on, when you're managing the team, what are the actions that you expect them to do in these tough times? And how do we readjust our methodology, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if you're a consultative sales team that goes after a certain industry, but because they've been disseminated post-COVID, you might change industries. Well, it's a different strategy, and you might have a different methodology there. Because,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not sure we've talked about this in the past, but you've got three elements to sales in anything, really. You've got the actions you're doing, like how often you make your calls, how often you write your emails, how often you meet your clients, and then what you say when you're actually in front of them.
Mm-hmm.
And then how the external forces affect that. Well, right now, what we're saying, tough times, is the external forces are having a negative effect on sales. Well, how do you readjust when that's happening? Maybe instead of making 10 cold calls to close one deal, now you've got to make 20 cold calls to close one deal. Well, then you got to talk about that with your team. You've got to strategize on that. You've got to have an action plan. It's sort of like, if it's raining one morning, well, you wear your raincoat. Yeah, you can go out in the rain with your t-shirt on. You'll get all wet, and if that's okay, you're taking that risk. But if you need to work outside for 8 hours and it's cold and rainy, well, you have to put your raincoat on and figure out how you're going to work in the rain. That's a little bit what we're saying here. The external forces, which you don't control, the economy, are having an effect of making your sales team have a tougher time. Well, first of all, how many of that team do I keep? And then what are the actions that I'm going to expect of them? And you need to be methodical there and say, okay, this is the size of the team. This is how it's going to work. You create an action plan, make them part of it. And then you say, well, these are the realistic results. Don't stick your head in the sand like a lot of people do. Just say, oh, I stick my head in the sand till, I don't have a choice but to fire everyone. Or hopefully it'll come around. Being hopeful or hoping things change is kind of silly. You've got a plan for how you're going to do things. Anyways, I've been talking a lot. Sorry. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think obviously that resonates. That makes sense. I think the more you can plan for it and adjust and keep it realistic. Obviously, if you've been investing in getting good data out of your CRM like beforehand, it's easier to see. Like you even catch trends early on, right? Like, well, I used to take 15 touch points to get like a discovery call, and then all of a sudden you're starting to realize like, oh, last week it was 17, was that, and then the week after like 20, and then like, okay, there's something. So then you can start readjusting, like, okay, well, if we need to do now like 30 touch points, like, is that doable? Like, is that realistic? And then obviously if you don't have that data available, like I think you have to maybe be a bit more intuitive about things. I like what you said about like making reps part of it. I think it's important. There's an ownership component to that as well, and Nobody likes just being told things, you know, like that's important. I think more on but what I feel too is that, and it's part of sales, but it's maybe more operational as well, is that, you know, look at how your process is being run right now, right? Like, I think a lot of people overestimate how, you know, simplicity will help your sales, right? Like when sales are becoming harder, if you're looking at your process and then like, okay, well then step one, the rep has to get you to fill like a 65-page document that like the specs out all the things, and then you have to do that, and then you have to wait for so and so to come back in to approve, right? Like that's a lot of steps and delays that can derail a sales process, especially when times are more difficult, right? Because it's so much easier for a prospect to say like, oh, my budget got cut, you know, like, and stuff like that. So I think it's also important to, when you're talking about the strategy, is like, yes, review the actions that you need to take, and you know, review the targets, right? Because they're probably not going to be the same than what they were when things were well. But also look at how things are being run internally. Like, I think it's a great time to start simplifying things. Do we really need to do things this way? Do we really, you know, why is there a bottleneck here? Like, why does it take so long for deals to go from, you know, stage 4 to stage 5? You know, like, why is there a 3-week delay there on average, right? What's going on during this stage? Where are we losing deals? Oh, we tend to be losing deals at stage 6. Like, what's happening at stage 6? You know, are we? And I think, again, like, and I'm repeating myself, but I think people really underestimate how simplicity impacts sales at the end of the day, right? Like, they're very comfortable with complex sales.
Yeah,
Like, not complex because it's a complicated sales, like you're selling a plane or something like that, but complicated because your internal processes are complicated.
I totally agree with you, Fab. You know, you need to simplify and look at the actions and the technology and how it's adjusted. So, like you just said, and I like that. So, in your strategy, let's look at how it affects the actions you need to do. So you're looking at your sales process, and if there's, like you said, you know, a stall somewhere in stage 6, well, what's happening in stage 6? What can we change to make that better, right? And in tough times, well, maybe that stage is, you know, that's where the whole length of the sales cycle is happening. You know, we did our proposal, and then we sit on our butts, and then nothing comes back. We used to get people, you know, 10% of the people used to come back and say yes. Now only 3% of the people are coming back and say yes. Well, what's going on, right? So in your strategy, you're analyzing the actions you need to do, but maybe in analyzing that, maybe it's just a new reality now. Instead of being a 10% close, can be 3% close. Well, what do you got to do? Increase the actions. You know, do more of the actions, and maybe tweak the methodology. So the external forces, you know, the economy, the market, that's affecting your strategy. And your strategy, when it comes to salespeople, is action and methodology. So your sales process is what methodology you're applying in an actionable way at different stages. So your methodology, which is, let's say, consultative sales, exists in your sales process, which exists in your CRM, and that's driving the actions you need to do. And then you're tweaking it to be as efficient as possible, but you're also realizing that those external forces will have a defining effect on different stages. Because if the economy is shit and people are buying less of your SaaS, and like I just said, 10% close rate goes down to 3% close rate, well, you might be doing everything right, but that's the reality. Well, then you need to decide, hey, darn, do I need my salespeople to do different actions? Do I need to do them to do more of these actions? You might need a bigger sales force. You might need to go see the head office and say, hey, look, instead of putting, you know, 5% in sales, we need to be putting 7% into sales to keep the flow going. Yeah, the bottom line will be different, but a lot of people have the instinct of saying, oh, times are tough, we're just going to reduce staff everywhere. Well, maybe it's the time to increase your staff in sales, because that'll help you out eventually. So you need to look at this. But if you have no data and it's all intuitive, you know.
And you're completely right about the staff thing. I mean, it's maybe the time to invest in more marketing. You know, we have Alyssa that comes to visit us once a month, and it's like she talks about marketing, but you know, it might be a time to actually double down in marketing. While others are cutting budget, you spend more time being out there, so that when things pick up again, or even today, you're more top of mind and
Yeah.
people reach out to you, or maybe it's time to increase your customer service, right? Like, because your customers are hurting too, and maybe having more people to help serve them is a good thing for you. If you know that your competitors are letting go customer service teams, maybe it's time to like beef up that part of the company as well.
Yeah, and it's going to be a strange analogy, but I'll put it out there anyways. Imagine the beginning of summer when there's a nice, or even in spring. Like, so today it's about, 55 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit out there. If it was spring, everyone would be outside. We'd all be in our shorts. In Montreal, it's warm in the spring. When you have like 15, 16 degrees Celsius. So, but at the end of the summer like this, it's like everyone's inside wearing their sweaters. Well, it's perspective, right? So maybe in that market, which is like the end of summer where things look like it's bleak when it's cold, but maybe that's an opportunity for you. And like you just said, maybe it's a time to increase your marketing, increase your efforts. But you need to have data to look at how you're going to do that intelligently and what expectations you have back from that. So what am I going to do? How am I going to tweak my sales process? What stages are going to look like? What are my expectations of my team? And maybe I'm changing the way things are done to create more efficiency to, like you said, take advantage of these crappy times to go and get a larger market share, which is going to help me in the long term. If you take the 30s as an example, where at the beginning of the Depression, you had 100 car manufacturers in the States. And at the end of the Depression, you had like 4 or 5. Well, a lot of people just gave up and said, but a lot of people said, we're going to keep to it. The GMs, the Chryslers, the Fords of this world, we're going to keep to it. They didn't have a great time, but they managed to slug through it and keep it going. And at the end, well, they became the big 3, right? So that was good. Admittedly, at the end of the 30s, you had World War II. They basically were given cash to make the war machine, but they stuck to it, right? So maybe it's the same thing for you. Like, instead of pulling back and sitting on your millions of dollars that you have in this cash flow, say, well, how can we invest? What can we ask our salespeople to do to get out there? And tactically speaking, what that means is your sales managers are now making sure that they're tweaking the actions to represent what's going to best help the company and the team have success. And how do you manage them? You're open to them. You're honest with them. You look at it with them. You look at the data, and you're as realistic as possible. Now, if you're really having a tough time, if it's like there's just no more money, then you've got to be honest and say, look, it's so tough. We have to minimize. We have to go on what do you call it? Life support for a year. So we're going to reduce the staff, by half. And then when things pick up again, but that's super dire. But it depends on your company. It depends on your cash flow. It depends on the coffers, how much money you have set aside. So there's not one solution for everyone, but you definitely have to look at the data and be realistic to get there. I don't know. It's kind of a high level conversation, but I think,
yeah, of course, because there's a lot of moving parts in there. But let's bring it back to sales specifically a bit. I think we touched on a few things that were really, like, so far we touched on 2 pillars. The way I see it is, like, we touched on the review your activities and your goals or KPIs, right? Because those will for sure change. There's review your processes, your methodologies. Like, is there a way of simplifying how things are done, right? Because the theory is, like, the more complexity you add, the more deals you'll lose, and each deal is much more important during a tough time. I think that the big last pillar is that we've touched on but didn't really mention flat out is the people, right? I think there's maybe more effort involved from the leadership team to talk to their reps. Like, I know, especially in sales, I think maybe in other departments it's maybe different. I could be wrong, but like, sales often have this image of this big bravado, like big, big talks, like big outgoing personalities, right? And so that gets mixed in. They're like, they're fine, right? But the reality is, like, when things are tough and there's their partner loses their job or whatever, it's hard for everybody. And there are some elements in there that I think managers or leaders, because managers also need their leaders to check in on them, is like what's going on with them, like what does this really mean for them on a one-on-one. And you don't want to pry or be intrusive or anything, but I think like checking in on your employees on a human basis is going to be crucial.
Well, and that's exactly actions methodology. And then you want to understand what you're talking about is their motivation, that individual's solidity in the state of mind they're in. So are they totally stressed out? Are they resilient? How do I make sure that they keep their motivation, right? How do I make sure that they keep moving forward? Well, if you understand your team's motivation and you have their back and you are going to do everything to help them out, and they feel at least secure enough that you're doing everything to help them out, and that they feel that you understand them, then it'll be a lot easier for you to ask for more actions in a certain way, or to tweak the actions and maybe to tweak the methodology because they trust you, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't really affect the external forces like the economy, what's going on. But if you know your team, if you understand their motivation, if you've looked at the strategy, if they feel you have their back, and then you're saying, well, let's look at how we can better, have a better action plan and have a better approach to, make our sales process as efficient as possible. They feel you have your back. You'll get the most out of them, and you'll get the most out of this hurtful economy,
Mm-hmm.
And it'll help you for good times, because if you do that in bad times and you have managed to have a certain amount of success, you're just gonna, when the good times come in and the air clears out and the fog lifts, they're just gonna, be the best team to approach that. And they're gonna say, hey, my company, my management had my back. They understood my motivation. They asked me a little bit more of me, and now, I'm being rewarded by these good times, which are going to take off. Because after bad times, there's always good times.
Yeah,
good times, bad times. I mean, it's what happens.
I remember one of the first interviews we did was with Lindsay from, I forget the name of his company though. I know you know him really well, but he was explaining, like, it was more on a prospecting level more than like a big macroeconomic level. But he would say, like, there's rarely 2 bad days in a row, right? So obviously on a macroeconomic, it's more than a few days, but it will always come back up again.
Yeah.
It does feel scary. And you do tend to focus on the negative of the moment, which is normal. It's normal human behavior, but things will get better, right? Like it could take a few months or years, who knows? But
the biggest problem with the hard economic times is how the leadership and the company sees its outcome. And if they don't have trust in their team and they don't have trust in their product, well, they're going to go into panic mode. And the executives are going to stick money in their pockets and go hide under a rock. They're going to go into ostrich mode. And then you've got companies like Ford and GM say, no, we're going to spend. This is an opportunity. So as a leader, as the owner, as the leadership of a company, you have to decide on that strategy. And if you go into ostrich mode, well, you're going to cut people and you're going to reduce staff and you're going to go into hibernation mode. You're going to, you're going to cut your staff by half, and the other half are just going to sit there and wait out the storm. And that's okay, but you're not going to come out the leader at the other end.
No.
So what you do in tough times will greatly affect, probably is a good indicator of what you're really made of.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, that was a tough one. That was a harsh one.
Let's end on that. That was a good conclusion.
All right. Perfect.
All right.
Hey, you did pretty well for a COVID guy. You didn't fall over.
No, like I said,
You're
it wasn't
tough.
so bad.
You're tough.
No, it was just pretty lucky. Honestly, it wasn't that bad at all. It's more like roller coaster ups and downs, but some harder moments, some easier moments. But yeah. All right, Paul. Thank you so much. See everybody next week.
See you next week.